If we are to get serious about our cities in Canada, what is that going to look like? And God, do something new and better, because your way is better. How do we do that? How do I make room for God to do bigger and better things in my heart, in my city, in my country?
What does loving your neighbor actually look like? This is Journey with Care, where curious Canadians get inspired to love others well through real-life stories and honest conversations.
Hey, Curious Sojourners, we're wrapping up our series Leading Differently Together. And oh my goodness, we have been on a journey. We've heard some brilliant and experienced people from across Canada, even one from the UK, who've shared their stories, their insight, and even challenged us on how we can lead better together. I hope you've been following along, but if you've not caught all the episodes yet, you have some fun binge listening to do as you're stuck in traffic or maybe tackling that load of laundry. Well, in Ephesians 4:11-12, it says, God gives some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry for building up the body of Christ. And as you followed the series, heard stories, and listened to our guests illustrate what this means in a Canadian context, I'm curious, which of the 5 resonate most with you? Were there things that made you curious? We'd love to hear from you. We've got the communication lines open, so head over to journeywithcare.ca. We read and respond to each and every one of you, so we hope to hear from you. I'm your host, Wendi Park, joined by producer Johan Heinrichs, and in studio today, we have a special guest who is my favorite person to wrap up this series with me. She's from Montreal, Quebec, and she loves the church and has made it her life's purpose to help city church networks thrive all across Canada. Currently, she's the domestic lead with Kentro and COO of City Leaders Collective and part-time doctoral student studying city impact networks. She's a busy person, but I'm thrilled to introduce to you Daria Nardozza. Welcome to the podcast, Daria.
Thank you so much, Wendi. It's really a delight to be here with you and Johan as well.
Well, it's so good to have you here. And listing off the things, the many hats that you wear, I imagine it took sacrifice to make us part of your schedule. Tell me a little bit more of those hats that you wear, maybe starting with the CLC, the City Leaders Collective. What is that all about?
Yeah, sure. So City Leaders Collective is something we're just sort of shaping and starting. I'm working on it with Eric Swanson and Rob Kelly, who live in the US. But we all just have a heart to see city networks and city network leaders flourish, and have developed some frameworks around that and just bringing the city church together for the good of the city. I've been doing this work in Canada for the last few years, well, on a Canada-wide level for the last few years. And led a city network in the West Island of Montreal for about 5 years. And just, something I'm super passionate about seeing happen. And then I'm also doing my doctoral studies with Eric and Rob to study impact networks and city networks as well, just trying to figure out what this very new thing looks like.
Yeah, there's many ways that we have connected and become good friends over this, but we've really geeked out on these topics. And I have really valued having conversations with you because you are so focused on the flourishing of city networks, church networks, and I think that's cool. I noticed actually on the website for CLC, your mission statement is very similar to ours, but unique, but you also connect and equip. We connect and equip the whole church. We're working more on the congregation members. How do we get them flourishing in the communities? But your mission statement actually says to connect and equip city network leaders for the flourishing of their cities. So looking at that whole network, can you tell me a little bit, when we say network, what do you mean by network?
Yeah, so we do kind of 3 things, which is connecting, like you do, but helping city networks and city network leaders have this place to connect and grow with each other. And we try to sort of curate tools and content to help them do that. And we have a couple frameworks. And then we coach. We just started a coaching cohort. Now we have 20 cities about that are part of that. So coaching city networks really to be able to grow and kind of win at their day job. But a lot of people are kind of like, well, what? I don't get it. Like, what's a city network? Mm-hmm. That's sort of the first question. And Rob, who I work with, sort of created this framework. And I mean, a framework is just a framework. It's not like capital T truth, but it's just something that's easy and portable to help us explain what is a city network. And so if you could imagine like a Venn diagram, with 3 circles, and if the middle is transform lives and cities, we would say we would do that through the 4 greats, which, one of the circles would be love, which is the great commandment. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So how are we doing that in a city? And then making disciples, which would be the Great Commission. And, we're called to go and make disciples. And then to serve, which is the Great Compassion. And I would even say justice. But how are we serving and loving our communities and our neighbors and our cities? And then the Great Collaboration, which is really what Jesus prayed in John 17, that the church would be one in the city. And so how are we doing those 3 things together, the 4 greats, the Great Commandment, the Great Commission, the Great Compassion, and doing that collaboratively in a city so that we could see true city transformation? And so that's sort of what a city network leader would wake up and think about in the morning. Like, how are we doing that as a city church in our community? And then I guess that kind of leads to what's Kentro.
Right.
And so I would say Kentro, they're doing the Great Compassion really well. They're networking people across Canada. We're networking people across Canada to better understand Christian community development and how we work with our cities and with our communities to see transformation happen, because that's really what we're called to as the church of the city.
And just for context, and I'm part of that advisory team. We've been helping get it off the ground together with many others as well. But there's actually 2,200 Canadian Christian charities doing local community development across our country. That's right. A lot. And in context with churches, there's over 25,000 churches across Canada. And they also have a desire to be in community engagement, to collaborate, but sometimes the infrastructure isn't there, or the way to, the how to. The willpower is there, but the how power is maybe needing development here at a local level. And I would imagine, back to the networking piece, what do you see across our nation among, like you said, there was 20 city networks that you've identified and that you're working with at different levels. Are they all the same? Or do you see wide differences, variety in how they work together in their own cities?
Yeah, no, they're definitely not all the same. And even as I learn more about city networks that are happening in the US and around the world, I mean, they all to some degree look different because every city is different and the people in the city are different. And so, I mean, like I said, this framework is just a framework, but for example, what this looked like in the West Island, how we did this, the Great Commandment, I mean, the West Island Network was sort of birthed out of an exegetical study of the community where pastors started to pray together, which led to them eventually hiring me to say, help us do this better. And so to do the Great Commandment, we prayed together 4 times a year. We brought the churches together beyond just the pastors to pray together for the city. We did different initiatives like that. And then making disciples, I mean, that's probably something we didn't do as well. However, something I was very intentional about as a city network leader is that I met with every single mayor in my community, every community organization. And so everything was very relational, representing churches that care about their neighborhood and their community. And then every month I would write a write-up on how the church could pray for this mayor, this city, this community organization, and then got them involved with that. And then eventually I also discovered that working with pastors was sometimes to really get out and do the Great Compassion and to serve our community was sometimes hard to just do with our pastors network. And so I asked all the pastors to recommend someone on their team that from their church that really has a heart for their neighborhood and their community. And we formed this CATE team, Community Action and Impact Team, where together as churches, we discovered how we could better serve our community. And I also facilitated in our community our poverty reduction and social inclusion roundtable and just got super involved with serving the community, but doing that with the church, with the community, and really trying to bridge those gaps of working collaboratively in our city. And so that's what it looked like in the West Island in Montreal. We did different events to helped with refugee support and just really got involved in many different ways. But what it looked like for us in Montreal would look really different for my friend Rob in Charlotte or for my friends in Vancouver or Ottawa. But there is something stirring across the country, and also as we see the church declining, 4,500 churches have shut down in Canada, I believe they say, in the last 10 years. And they actually predict that in the next 10 years, up to 10,000 churches might close in Canada. So as the church declines, we need to learn to work better together as Christians across our city to do those four greats really well.
Well, I think that's really important to highlight and underscore, because we're not just talking how can the church be social good in the community, but how can we bring nutrients and life and vitality and flourishing within the local church? Because there's a crisis there as well, that there's mutual benefits to cities flourishing for the church and for the greater community. And that's where Care Impact is excited to partner with you and some of the developments that you're working on, as well as we are able to bring some practical ways that churches can engage their community for collective impact, working with other churches, working across the ecosystems of different social services and different sectors working together, and some resources to, I hear some pain points from pastors and leaders saying, we have good vision for compassion, but we have a hard time even getting volunteers for our kids program. It's sobering when you said 4,500 churches across Canada have closed and there's more coming. How do we help revitalize the church and bring discipleship back central so that their congregation members aren't a liability, but an asset to the community, an asset to the pastors and leaders that have been called to lead? And I think that's great. I'm just wondering, though, did you just wake up one day and say, hey, I would love to do networking with churches in Canada and be that specific? Or were you a little girl with pigtails saying, one day I'm going to do what you see yourselves doing now? Or how did you even get into this? I'm curious about your backstory of what led you into this very needed role that you have in Canada.
Well, I grew up in Montreal, which, as most of you know, doesn't have a large Christian community. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I'm a second of four kids. And actually, when my parents were going through a divorce when I was 10, 11, 12, my mom shipped the four of us off to my grandparents' house 6 hours away. And that's where I first actually learned about Jesus and sort of was introduced to this faith in God. But I really only became a Christian when I was 16, which was a pretty big 180 for me, without going into all those details. And actually, when I was 17, that was my grade 11 year. And I worked two jobs, saved all my money so that when I was 17, I could go to Bible school and just figure out who God was. And it was there, those couple years, that I sort of felt this call to maybe ministry that I was trying to figure out. Yeah, long story short, I ended up doing my bachelor's degree in counseling and psychology, where I think I sort of just counseled my way through my life in that degree, and was planning to go do a master's degree in counseling. And I think my pastor saw my apostolic gifting and challenged me and said, no, you shouldn't do a counseling degree, Daria. And that's when he introduced me to one of my mentors, Dr. Glenn Smith, who actually helped me through my graduate studies in global urban leadership or ministry. So studying the social effects of globalization and urbanization and what churches could be doing better in cities, really. And that's what really introduced me to the city work. At the time, I was working for 24/7 Prayer Canada and International. And so I contextualized all my studies to prayer, mission, and justice in cities in Canada. And I think I always had this heart for the church and for unity. And then when it came to starting a network for my city, I didn't know what that was. No one at the time really, we're all trying to figure it out. And so as I got more into that, I think that's what really grew my heart for this kind of work.
So I find it interesting that you mentioned that your pastor drew it out of you, that shepherd leader in the congregation. We listened to an episode previous with my friend, Reverend Vince Solomon, on shepherding, but he drew it out of you and inspired you and saw that apostolic gift within you that has set you on this path. And I can see how that apostolic gifting has served well for the local church in Montreal, within your network, but also in the studies and the work you're doing across city networks because it requires a lot of creativity, thinking outside the box, a lot of listening to social contexts, but also listening to God, all of those things. So that's beautiful to hear. We're wrapping up a series here, Leading Differently Together, and I think this is a good segue to reflect on some of the previous episodes that we've been going through with Ephesians 4. And I thought maybe you and I could just dialogue a little bit on each of those episodes that we've listened to and I've been able to be a part of. And I would love your perspective, too, on what you're seeing in City Networks. And I imagine that you're working across a lot of diversities of giftings within that. So let's dive right into the Apostolic. I was interviewing Donovan Friesen, pastor here in Winnipeg. Was there anything there that stood out to you and the work that you're doing in City Networks?
Well, I loved Donovan's interview. He was one of my favorites, probably because that's also my
It resonated, right?
Gifting. Oh, really resonated. And I'm like, I want to be more like him when I grow up. I loved how I assume prophetic is his second, but I don't know. I don't know if he said that. And I think as an apostolic leader, and I actually thought that my second was prophetic. It's not, it's evangelism. And I was kind of disappointed because I feel like I feel like as an apostolic leader, you have to be like prophetic because when you're doing it long enough, you learn that like you can't do this without God.
Right. And I think Kath would say in the interview with the prophetic that we can all hear God. And so there's a piece that we can grow that muscle. And I assume that even with your work with 24/7 prayer, that you grew that muscle to be able to hear the voice of God. So that prophetic isn't not there. It's just maybe not as prominent as the other ones that evangelism surprised you, didn't it?
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And so I loved how he really highlights it in his story that he, as an apostolic leader, also relies heavily on being led by God in prayer. Prayer is like such an important part of his life and his ministry, and being led by, taking risks and doing these things that he's done and being a builder that he talks about. I think we can't do that as an apostolic leader without being super prayerful and living really close to God.
Yeah. And do you notice in the City Networks that you're working with across Canada that apostolic leadership integrated in those teams across the cities? Do you see that coming out in the work you're doing?
Oh, yeah. Like, I feel like most people who lead City Networks are those apostolic, entrepreneurial kind of giftings, personalities, because there's so much unknown about this area and we're all trying to figure it out. You kind of have to be a little bit that way.
And I think one of the apostolic giftings that came out also in my interview with him is that we need everybody around the table, and that is important, and that the apostolic leader is able to draw. They're not trying to be the prominent one on the stage, but they're able to see something that's broken or see something that could be created into alignment and draw the giftings from other people around them to really cause it to flourish. Because I also carry that kind of wiring within me, and I like to start things. And it's not like I leave things hanging, but I also depend on other giftings around me to keep it flourishing. And I think that's an important thing to highlight of what he was talking about. We are disruptors, but hopefully for the good when we're healthy, right? What about the prophetic? We talked a little bit about Kath Livesey. One of the things that her quote that I will always have in memory here is she made it so simple, and obviously because she talks about accessible prophecy is her ministry. But it's really hearing God speaking and repeating what he says. I thought that was kind of a profound way of looking at the prophetic. My question to you is, like, how do you see the prophetic across Canada? How is it expressed? How is it being vocalized across the City Networks? Where do you see this expression?
Yeah, I love, too, how she wants to make it more accessible. And I think when we hear prophetic, we think, oh, that's not me, or, oh, that's only like for a few. But really, that's everybody. Like, we're all sort of, somewhat called to these five-fold gifts. It's just we are more dominant in some than others. And so I think a lot of people are afraid of the prophetic, but it's just such an area that I've loved growing in, even though it's not my top. but an area that we could all continue to grow in.
And maybe more natural than we often think, that it's not like some woo-woo type of thing in the sky, some magical moment, but it's just like, my sheep hear my voice. And what is God saying through our society, through our church, through my personal experience, and just paying attention to that, and humbly being able to bring it into a context of community, that they're not isolated yaysayers of what has to happen. They're not the dominant voice in there, but they're the listening part and saying, what is God saying? And being able to create safety within a church or a network to be able to speak those things out and discern what is of God and what are things that we need to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm. And probably too, because it has been, somewhat abused, people are afraid of it. And so that's unfortunate, but it's like, what is healthy prophetic?
That's right. Well, evangelism, we took a little different twist than I think a lot of people might be expecting, because they're thinking more of like the Billy Graham or the tracts or telling people about Jesus. We really went on a different tangent with Ellen. Actually, you know Ellen, don't you?
I do. I love Ellen.
Who doesn't know Ellen? Because Ellen is just very networked across Canada, and she's an awesome person. But what I loved about what she was talking about in her personal story is just articulating your own story. And she does this very well through her own marketing and communications business, Graf Martin Communication. Mm-hmm. But it's really about articulating our own story and identifying what God has done through us. She says it like this: learning how to articulate your own story and identifying what God has done through us, I think, is a massive first step in being able to share the gospel. It's more of, what has God done within me, and can we articulate that? And sometimes my story is probably a lot more boring than yours, Daria. Yours has a little bit more sweet and spicy and salt in there from your background, what you've already described. Mine is Shimon Fat. It's Mennonite. It's pretty guarded. I had a beautiful childhood. It's not perfect by no means, but still, what has God done in my life, and can that be brought into the glory of God? I think it is a challenge for each one of us, maybe particularly those who haven't had a diverse background, but evangelism is really being able to still see and pursue God's work in our life, that we don't just arrive because we have a belief set and now we can tell others how to get to heaven, but it's more of like, what is God challenging me now? How is my prayer life enhanced? Or how did I work through that grief process or disappointment and things like that, and be able to connect with others? Any thoughts that you have on evangelism?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I met Ellen about a year ago, and I remember asking her at an event something. I just wanted to ask her some quick communication question, and then we ended up having a 2-hour conversation.
That sounds like Ellen.
Total freebie that she sort of helped me through, how do you communicate your story, and she really helped me see that. I mean, she's just a gift to Canada and this world, but that communicating your story is not a bad thing. Because sometimes you're afraid to share your story and you're afraid to be vulnerable, or you're afraid to be who you are, be who God made you to be. And, who do you want to reach with your story, and how do you, and how can you do that well and effectively? But the whole relationships, that's evangelism, right? Especially in a country like we live in, I think the best evangelism happens just through real relationship. Yeah. So I love that she brought that perspective, and it's not just about the big event, but how we're actually just living and telling our story of who God is in our life.
Well, and I think somebody that's gifted and healthy in evangelism, it's more natural in the sense they want to tell, they have something to share. It's like they have this best kept secret. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you've got to hear this story, or there's something that within your story that resonates with something God has done in my life. It's not a drudgery, I should tell them about the Lord. Thus saith the Lord. It's more of a attractional, magnetic thing. And I love how people like Ellen, with the gift of evangelism, is able to draw that out of others who may not otherwise see themselves as an evangelist. But we all have the mandate to share the good news, but they are able to draw that out and make it more accessible to the rest of us so that we can truly be living examples, authentic in community. Again, like you said, being relational. Well, I love the conversation I had with my friend, Vincent Solomon, on shepherding. He is a pastor here in Winnipeg, a Cree pastor, and we talked about what that was like within the Anglican Church and his experience as a role of a shepherd. Any thoughts? You deal with a lot of pastors, but as you were listening to his, was there any thoughts that jumped out at you in that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thought was that I just love that he knew he was called to be a pastor when he was 10 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like he knew. And I do think that my husband's also, he's a teacher by vocation. He's a high school math teacher, but he's a pastor. He's a pastor at heart. And he's known that, I think, his whole life, that he has that gifting. And so,
well, and he knew that as a young child. And then what I loved also, what followed, is that it was confirmed within the church, within the elders that he sought advice with. They nurtured that and they saw it in him, even when he didn't always see it in himself. And I know we didn't get into the whole story on the episode, but the struggle with the church and then the way Indigenous were treated and his own Cree experience hasn't been easy. And I remember asking him, how did you pursue pastoring after you've been so wounded, and your people and generations have been so wounded? And I remember profoundly him telling me, well, if I'm not going to shepherd in those spaces, how can we expect different change and nurturing to happen? And sort of that idea of being that nurturing change that he wanted to see within the church, rather than saying, I'm done with the church. He loves the church. And I think that's a real true shepherd heart, that they're going to endure those things for the sake of the people that he's able to care and give them a different experience, with a lot of the indigeneity woven in, not as syncretism, but saying, how do we be truly authentic ourselves? And how do I nurture your authentic selves in following Jesus? And I couldn't have looked for a better example of a friend that does it every day with his congregation. So that was a true gift. Teaching with Amy Jo Smith. Oh my goodness. I enjoyed having that conversation with her, a natural born teacher. And some of the things that she drew out, I think there was so much there for the local church, for church networks, in how we nurture the body of Christ, and even city networks. Was there anything there that stood out to you that you wanted to comment on?
Yeah. Some of the most impactful people in my life have been my teachers. And I think she alludes to that as well. And she talks about Joni and Friends, her experience working there. And she says the embodied experiences of working with people and getting on the floor and being with them, and teachers are just incredible humans, and have such potential to impact, especially the ones who are doing it really well and actually incarnating and embodying, like she talks about Joni and Friends and getting down on the floor.
Yeah.
And she also finishes with this reflecting on who loved you into being and what are some of the things that you want to share with others, and I just love that.
Who loved you into being? That is a profound question that stood out to me as well. Yeah, and I loved the humility that she had in that perspective of that co-learning with her students. Yeah, she might be the teacher in the room, but she's co-learning and she's able to adapt even how she takes them on this learning journey based on some of the feedback and the humility it takes to not just be the person in charge. But she even said, I always say my greatest teachers and my professors have been the children that I've gotten to walk alongside and journey with. And I think that is a profound thing, that imagine that in a church setting as we're teaching, that we're co-learning together. Yes, there might be some biblical truths and some things that the church will want to teach, but being adaptive to the environment and to who is there, not overlording that information, but learning from Some of the greatest teachers in my life, I reflected when she said that, some of the greatest teachers and professors in my life have been the children that have joined our family, and some of the social workers that have allowed me to walk alongside their difficult journey, and some of the families that we get to participate with in community through the care portal, and some of the youth that are aging out. I think, you know what, there's such teaching moments that we don't have to come there knowing all the answers, but we can actually co-learn, and we can help, but we can also receive. I think that was a very profound way of looking at teaching. There was one thing that stood out interviewing all of the guests that we had in the last episodes through this series. One of the things that I saw as a commonality, even though these giftings are very different and unique, was this element of listening, that the Apostolic was listening to their community, was listening to God and thinking of new ways because they were inspired by God. The prophetic was listening to God and saying what they heard. The evangelist was listening to what God was doing in their life. And she even talks about listening more than actually just speaking out the words, and understanding. Communication is understanding your audience by listening. She highlighted shepherding was really listening to the sheep and how he can respond to them. Teaching was about listening to your students, and all of them were so much on listening and less on the authority. None of them came very authoritative, saying, I have this gift, and so therefore, church, listen up, society, listen up. Just this attitude of listening. And so in all of these contexts, in all of these giftings that God has gifted the church with, we can still sum it up with, my sheep hear my voice, right? There's this aspect of being good listeners, I thought was kind of profound in all of them.
Oh yeah, so key. And I mean, just so key to be a great leader in this world today. It starts with listening.
Mm-hmm. It's just a great way to not feel all the pressure to have all the right answers and to nail it with everything we are called to do. It's listening and responding. And I think that's a huge gift. So Daria, as we wrap up this episode and this series, I guess the question I have for you in the work that you're doing is, how do city networks and local churches, how do they benefit from embracing the diversity of these giftings? What are some of your insights that you're seeing?
Yeah, something I've been seeing, and that actually has been really heavy on my heart lately, is a bit of a leadership crisis that we have across our country, maybe around the world, I don't know, but I definitely see it in Canada and in Quebec. I really see it. And I was reminded yesterday, I had a meeting with Chuck Proudfoot from At Work on Purpose, and he reminded me that 1% of Christians do this work, like do Christian ministry vocationally, and 99% of Christians are not, leaders in the church, so to speak. But every Christian has one of these gifts, everyone, we all have them. And so even as we experience this leadership crisis, how do we mobilize the whole church, all 100% into their gifting and into their calling to live out who God created them to be in the body of Christ?
Yeah, no, that is profound. Are you seeing certain giftings more prominent and more accessible within churches and church networks than others, and some that are needing more giftings to balance the ecosystems?
Not necessarily. I don't see any need more than another, but I think as people learn their gift and are empowered in it, then I think that they will want to use it and want to feel like they're part of a community of people that are using their gifts. And it's not just one leader that leads and does everything, does all 5 of those things. But if we're all using what God has given us to lead together, then I think that really helps solve a bit for our leadership crisis.
Yeah, and you say leadership crisis, and I think we could look at these giftings and those needing to flourish. And I think also some of the things that have united us in some of our conversations and experiences has also been the need for diversity around the table, both in multiculturalism, but also having male and female women leaders as well. There's a needed voice there at the table Is there anything that else that you would say is needed for the flourishing of the Canadian church, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more female leaders around the table and women being, encouraged and raised up to feel like they can have a voice and they can lead. I mean, they feel like that in the rest of the world. I think it's just the church world that is still a bit of a struggle for women. So for women to have a voice, and not at the expense of men, and not to lessen the role of men. Right. I really deeply appreciate men and their leadership, but how can we work better together and really work at this together, male and female, as a holistic picture of the church.
Yeah, and I think it requires a certain level of listening again, to say maybe that tension isn't even felt around those tables or those city network tables or those church leadership tables, because maybe it's the prominent voice. So if it's just males around the table, they won't necessarily realize that there is a deficit there. And so listening again to the broader church will add value. God says he equips the church to edify, to equip, and to build up. And so this is, again, not an authoritative struggle. It's more on building up and edifying the church so that we can work better together. And I would also say the same could be said. We've talked about women and men in ministry. We briefly touched on the cultural diversity, which I think is very important. And Vincent and I talked a little bit about that, but also denominationalism. What are you seeing within the networks about the unity of the church? Are denominations coming together that are very diverse, or do we have some more leadership work to do in that as well?
Oh, well, that's a loaded question, Wendi.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah, there are definitely denominations very willing to work together. And there's definitely others not willing to work together. And so it's tough. And I also understand in the city space and the city network space, there's denominations that are willing to feed the homeless together or do something more practical. But there's others, that wouldn't be willing to pray with someone of a different denomination or plant a church, do church planting networks. They're pretty specific about the people they would network to plant churches with. And so I get that sometimes, but there's definitely some hard divides these days, and it's tough to navigate. And honestly, I see some of the city network leaders out there who are just exhausted because they're navigating it. And it's hard, and they just want to stay in relationship and keep peace and love their community. But it's tough.
Yeah. And I think that's true. It is tough. But when we're saying the unity of the church, we're not saying uniformity, but sometimes there's a lot of polarizing topics and secondary theologies that can divide. Just like any of these APEST, they could say, well, this is the way, but there's a need for a lot of spiritual humility to be able to sit amongst our differences and listen to the other. Because when we listen to each other and we are focused on Christ, who is the unifier, not the uniformity, the conformist, that's when the beauty of the church can be seen in the community. That's when communities can flourish, because there is an outpouring of the Holy Spirit out of that unity, that the world can see that the church is one. Any last concluding thoughts before we conclude this episode?
I think my prayer for the last couple months, and it's just, there's a song that's called Make Room. And I think what my prayer has been I have this sticky note on my wall here. I will make room for you to do whatever you want to. And I think that's sort of my prayer for Canada too. But like, God, what do we need to make room for you to do maybe different? And there's actually a line in the song that says, shake up the ground of all my tradition, break down the walls of all my religion. Your way is better. Oh, your way is better. And so like that, I think that's just been my prayer lately for Canada. But God, what are you doing that's new? Because something new needs to happen. And, almost over 80% of Canada is urban, is people live in cities. And so if we are to get serious about our cities in Canada, what is that going to look like? And God, do something new and better.
Yeah.
Because your way is better. Yeah. And how do we do that? How do I make room for God to do bigger and better things in my heart, in my city, in my country?
Wow, that is a great way to end this series, actually, to make room. And sometimes God speaks by making room for other people around your table that might be different than you, very different, purposely different than you. Making room for God and leaving space for society to speak to us. There's making room in so many ways that God wants to allow our cities to flourish. So thank you so much, Daria, for coming onto the podcast. And I'm looking forward to future conversations and working closely with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Wendi. I've really appreciated this whole series. So keep on.
Thank you for joining another conversation on Journey with Care, where we inspire curious Canadians on their path of faith and living life with purpose in community. Journey with Care is an initiative of Care Impact, a Canadian charity dedicated to connecting and equipping the whole church to journey well in community. You can visit their website at careimpact.ca or visit journeywithcare.ca to get more information on weekly episodes, Journey with Prayer, and details about our upcoming events and meetups. You can also leave us a message, share your thoughts, and connect with like-minded individuals who are on their own journeys of faith and purpose. Thank you for sharing this podcast and helping these stories reach the community. Together we can explore ways to journey in a good way. And always remember to stay curious.